Hi there, I'm Jonathan. Now, pedantry has to have an outlet, especially around something as important as storytelling. And in this video, we're talking stage plays.
It's the only way to know a man's real character.
I've had a few pantomimes and comedies published. But one genre I'd love to try one day is farce. One thinks of the classic bedroom farces of Ray Cooney from the 1980s period, for example. Intricately structured and packed with humiliating misunderstandings, hapless philandering, and frantic love cheats trapped in wardrobes, often separated from their trousers.
Helen? Who's Helen?
I am. Hello.
This quintessentially British theatrical heritage is what came to mind when I was reading the blurb for No Dinner for Sinners by Edward Taylor. According to his Wikipedia entry, Taylor, who was born in 1931 and appeared in the Cambridge Footlights Review in 1955, was spotted by BBC talent scouts shortly after. He was given a one-year contract, but went on to participate in the corporation's radio and TV output until around 1990. No Dinner for Sinners is a 2015 addition to the catalogue of publishing giant Concorde Theatricals, who describe it at their website as follows. Jim Watt runs the London office of a stock exchange firm and is hosting dinner for the international director and his wife, Bill and Nancy McGregor, members of the Anti-Permissive Society group.
As Bill strongly disapproves of unmarried couples living together, Jim asks his girlfriend Helen to pose as his wife for the evening. This suggestion goes down like a lead balloon, and Helen walks out on him, leaving Jim with no partner, no cook, and, after ringing around all his ex-girlfriends, rather unsuccessfully, only one last option: his eccentric cleaning lady Edna, who will do the job, for a fee of course. Disaster reigns, as Edna attempts to cook an elaborate dish while keeping her guests happy with religious chat. At an extremely inopportune moment, Helen returns to play the role of his wife, and so does his young personal assistant Terry. A string of hilarious miscommunications unravel as Jim tries to save the situation and his job by trading lies and wives almost as quickly as Bill is trading shares.
I was looking it up earlier this year for the sake of curiosity, immediately after having seen it staged by my local amateur dramatic society, who I can report took it on with their customary gusto and flourish. But this video is reviewing the script, not that production. I will try to minimise spoilers by divulging little more of the plot than is revealed in that summary I just read for you. But be hereby advised, it's not fully spoiler safe. To declare my interest, I'm not reviewing it because I loved it or because I hated it. I'm reviewing it because I like bits of it, and a lot of it I found puzzling. So, question. In what era would you suppose this was set, just going by that premise? Consider a mile. My main character is Jim Watt, a London-based finance executive. His prudish boss is in town, over from America, with his wife in tow, coming to dinner. He asks his live-in girlfriend to pretend for the evening that they're married, but she's so offended she packs her bags and storms out. His eccentric cleaner then steps in to help. Back in spring of this year, 2023, I was considering that very question halfway through Act 1, when the dialogue suddenly made reference to the present UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. A while later it made reference to the King, not to the Queen, as would have applied between the years 1952 and 2022, but to the King. Now obviously those references were substitutions made by the drama group, but I remember being momentarily surprised and thinking, oh, is this not set in the 1970s or 80s then? Because if it's set in 2023, or even 2015, or even 2005, why does no one have a mobile phone? Why do the conservative social political leanings of the boss have any ramifications on Jim's career prospects? Does modern employment law and equality legislation not exist? Why hasn't his Facebook profile already betrayed his marital status? The blessed wall-mounted phone won't stop ringing, but where are all the gadgets and tokens of modernity?
Question.
The creatives behind this particular production must have decided to set it in 2023, I concluded. But what period, I then pondered, had the writer had in mind? I checked the website when I returned home, only to find under period it said contemporary. I'll come back to that. Overall, it was a decent enough piece. It had some funny lines, it gave the actors some good scope to go large with their characterisation, especially in the case of Edna, and they did it with a flourish. The first act did most of the setting up, while in the second act the writers skillfully cranking up the mayhem as the dinner party shenanigans unfold. I thought it had 4 nicely distinct female characters, with Edna and Nancy suitable for slightly older actors, and then with Helen and especially Terry suitable for slightly younger ones. I found them all well drawn and memorable. The role of Jim allows for plenty of pomposity, sliding towards manic desperation as events unfold, and the role of Bill plenty of opportunity for bemusement interspersed with moral indignity. The summary already tells us that having commenced the soiree with Edna posing as Jim's wife,
Oh, this is my, wife.
we then have the complication of Helen's reappearance.
Oh, Jim.
There's a particular contrivance that I like quite a lot. Just to repeat that little spoiler warning, I'm going to give that away now,
Helen, what the hell are you doing here?
because it sets up a pivotal chunk of the second act. Okay, so while Nancy is off adjusting her contact lenses, Bill is introduced to Jim's wife in the form of Edna, ambling in from kitchen duties, looking like mutton dressed as lamb, dressed as Danny LaRue. Later, with Edna back in the kitchen and Bill off in Jim's study looking up share prices, Helen reappears, and before Jim can co-opt her into his scheming, Nancy's intruded upon it, and to her, Jim's wife is introduced as Helen.
Helen, what the hell are you doing here?
That's better. This must be your wife.
No.
That's right, Mrs. McGregor. I'm Helen.
Thus, this is the point where the writer has put his protagonist in an unbreakable bind. Even if you could coordinate the mutually antagonistic Helen and Edna to continue in their roles of fake wife, how are you going to get through a whole dinner with Bill and Nancy when each of them believes you're married to a different person? It's the sort of devilish scenario that fans of UK sitcom will have seen skewering Basil Fawlty in various episodes of Fawlty Towers, or might recognise in a particularly brilliant episode of Only Fools and Horses. I'm talking about the one where, to take advantage of a free holiday in Spain, Rodney, his wife Cassandra, and his devious older brother Del have to keep up the pretense that the gangling but fresh-faced Rodney is still a teenager, while Cassandra and Del are his parents. Hapless Rodney's role extends into having to take part in an under-15 skateboard race and getting adopted into the Groovy Gang. Treat yourselves, go and watch it. Season 6, Episode 4, The Unlucky Winner Is. But back to the play. The dissimilar wives contrivance also sets up some neat gags where Nancy, for example, opines about what a beautiful wife Jim has, and Bill nearly spits out his whiskey in incredulity.
She's one of the most attractive women I've ever met. I wish I looked like her.
Well, stand out in the rain for a month and you might.
But that's the engine of a good farce, in my opinion. A relatively ordinary person is thrown into a chaotic situation, and the audience is drawn into rooting for their deliverance from that catastrophe, whilst knowing it's almost certainly futile, but hoping some silver lining or last-minute reprieve may just come into play. I have 4 key criticisms of the piece. Here's number 1. Jim, the ever-present subject of the dilemma, is not very relatable. Del is always rather economical with the truth, but he's full of working-class charisma, and he's a trier. Rodney is gormless, but he's likeably gormless, and he's always well-intentioned. Basil Fawlty is a terrible snob, but he's trying to run an independent guest house whilst hindered by some truly obnoxious guests, some truly incompetent members of staff, and whilst living under the constant tyranny of his wife. So while he's not always likeable, you can feel for him. But Jim Watt, being hard to invest in emotionally, his ensuing tribulations just don't press the viewer's sympathy buttons. From the outset, he's shown as being incredibly infantile in his day-to-day affairs. At the opening curtains, he's seen up early at the weekend, but opting selfishly not to disengage from a game of Space Invaders when the telephone starts ringing, forcing his girlfriend Helen to get out of bed to answer it. Then, emptying cereal all over the table and some onto the floor in order to get a water pistol out from the bottom of the cereal packet, which he proceeds to fill at the table with a jug messily and start shooting at Helen. Moments later, he's seen reclaiming a piece of chewing gum that he'd previously stuck under the dining room table. Actions that, if presenting in a 6-year-old, would probably end up in them getting statemented, not entrusted with running a high-octane financial enterprise. He's thoughtlessly presumptuous in blithely asking Helen to pretend to be his wife. She's rather tired of waiting for a genuine proposal, we discover.
Yes, and you never once
He's dumbfounded at her storming out, but moves straight on to digging out his little black book and phoning around to his ex-girlfriends. Calling them in turn on his trusty house phone, trying to persuade one of them to attend this dinner appointment that very evening. And again, mystified at not hitting the jackpot. Moments later, he's getting over-familiar with Terry, his young personal assistant.
Got some papers for Mr. Watt. I'm Terry Pringle from his office.
When she drops by with urgent reports he needs to sign.
Have you got any hobbies, like, cooking, for example?
Terry may not mind the attention, but Helen would hardly be impressed. So, rather than relatable, he's the opposite. He's almost impossible to believe in, and even if he could be believed in, what we find in him are mostly unlikable character traits. What's more, life seems to keep dealing him aces, no matter how poorly he behaves.
Any other time I'd love to be your wife, in any way you like.
If anything, I'd have been quite pleased to see him fired. It might have punctured his massive sense of entitlement. A related point, to move on to my second criticism, is of these weird behaviours taking you out of the moment. No sooner has Jim thrown cereal all over the floor than Edna is in there trying to clean it up. But instead of throwing it away, she scoops up a couple of handfuls into her overall pocket to eat later. The dusty mixture reappears in Act 2 in a snacking bowl offered to their bemused guests, but not with enough comic impact, in my opinion, that it was worth damaging the relatability of another main character at her first appearance. If Edna were so miserably poor that she needs to scoop up discarded cereal, couldn't she just steal cereal straight out of the packet? Or ask the kindly Helen for a pay rise? Why is she scavenging it from off the floor?
Question?
But we're not done with the odd behaviour there. Still, in the opening minutes of the play, Edna is using the vacuum cleaner when the phone starts ringing. She stops the vacuum, answers the phone, passes the handset to Jim. Then, to my astonishment as I sit in my seat, she immediately starts up the vacuum cleaner again, yards away from him. Who would do that? It's not because she entirely lacks deference for him, because she routinely refers to him as Mr. Watt. It just makes you think, why is she doing this? And then it makes you think, well, he could just take that cordless telephone and move it away from where she's using the vacuum cleaner, but oh no, hang on. No, we can't do that because I'm watching a play. And he'll have to have that conversation in my earshot where all of us can hear him having it. So Jim has to break off to tell Edna to stop, which she does, sassily, minor titter. But the point is it pulls you out of the storytelling experience if your focus is being drawn away to thinking about the fact that you're watching a play. And for almost no reason. It's not like it has a big comic payoff later in the piece. It's odd. I can't think why this moment gets written into the script, why it doesn't get pruned out of the script in the editing process. We have ample opportunity to see that Edna's eccentric from her mannerisms and her attire. We don't need to see her doing things that are jarringly peculiar for no reason and no real payoff. Criticism 3 is around the character of Terry. She's a smart, attractive young thing. She's fond of her boss for reasons that are fairly inexplicable, but amount to a preference for older men. Being charming and a whiz in the kitchen, she looks like she's the perfect candidate for the role of Jim's wife. She'd love to, in fact, until she realises he needs her later that very evening. She has a prior commitment, a theatrical rehearsal, so she can't do it. It's completely out of the question. Picking up the side reports, Terry departs. Can you preempt my criticism with this point? We know from the publisher's summary that Terry will reappear in Act 2 to join in the dinner party mayhem. The audience probably won't have read that summary though, so to the typical viewer in the audience, her reappearance in Act 2 can come as an enjoyable surprise. But it can't really, can it? Because her Act 1 contribution is such a narrative cul-de-sac that it's blindingly obvious she must reappear in the second act, otherwise what was the point of her being there at all? And as an act of storytelling, the reason for her reappearing in the second act is also slightly unsatisfying. It turns out the rehearsal was cancelled. So yeah, that's it, it was cancelled. She could have done it after all, and she duly reappears at Jim's flat. I think the writer's instincts were correct in wanting to have this bonus character in the story, and in wanting to introduce her in Act 1, and then apparently sideline her, before throwing her back into the chaos of Act 2. But I also think that when he sat down to ponder the mechanics of how he was going to make that come about, he just went with the first lame thing that came into his head. Oh, let's just say the thing was cancelled. With a tiny bit more thought, it could have transpired that Edna, say, is the caretaker of the community centre where that rehearsal is going to take place. And because she's so distracted by all this stuff going on with Jim's dinner guests, She's forgotten to tell her husband to go and unlock the centre. They all turn up, it's not open, then it gets cancelled. And that ties in nicely with the main story. Or Terry could have just lost her mobile phone. It could have just slipped out while she was canoodling with Jim and slid down the side of the sofa. On silent mode. When she eventually works out where she must have left it, she reappears. Oh, but hang on. No one's got a mobile phone. I'll come back to that. A fourth and final criticism relates to the structural integrity of the dilemma in which Jim is placed. As I see it, when the protagonist of a farce is thrust into their quandary, the audience is willing to suspend disbelief about the contrivances that have established that situation, as long as the characters are doing their best to get out of it. We expect the protagonist to seek their deliverance through reasonable decision making and relatable behaviours and choices. If the characters need to pass up obvious escape routes and options, then it indicates that the dilemma the writer has created is not structurally sound. And if this dawns even partially on the audience, then a sense of tension will start seeping away. Some of the interest evaporates, even if they don't consciously realise it's happening. Once Jim has 2 wives in the flat, he's relatively lacking for safe places to stash them. Nancy has been in the main bedroom's ensuite facility adjusting her contact lens. Bill has been in and out of the study buying and selling shares on Jim's terminal. But fairly soon after Helen re-enters the flat, Nancy emerges, catches her, and she has to be introduced as Jim's wife. Fair enough, but Helen doesn't half spend a lot of time throwing herself into trouble's path. The audience knows that the kitchen is a safe space because Jim has already explained that his wife won't tolerate anyone going in there. So, why not just bundle Helen in there? Well, one reason is that if the conspirators are all based in the kitchen, we, the audience, can't see or hear them. But that's not the audience's problem to solve, that's the writer's problem to solve. Even after Nancy sees Helen, thus with the 2 dinner guests being introduced to a different version of Jim's wife, it still feels like there's a fairly obvious escape path. Jim could simply tell his guests his wife's been struck down with a migraine whilst out in the kitchen, and she won't be reappearing. Obviously that version would ruin the tale and make it a hopeless spectacle. But like I say, if the writer doesn't block up the obvious escape routes for the protagonist, then it risks the audience stepping back and wondering why Jim doesn't take a simple measure to effect his own escape. I think in a good farce you want to see your characters thinking on their feet more quickly than you can, not being a little bit dim and slow about everything.
Been mucking about.
Yeah. Oh, yes?
Is Rodney back yet?
Oh, yeah, come in, just a minute. I'll give him a shout. Rodney, the RK lorry's here.
So that was 4 main points of criticism, and there's a couple of tiny quibbles that I'm going to throw in here as well. If you put a couple in a play and you call them Bill and Nancy, I will expect to be treated, even if it's a very subtle allusion, to a reference to Oliver Twist. If you're not going to provide anything of that nature, don't call them Bill and Nancy. It's like calling them Homer and Marge, or Ross and Rachel. The second one. The excuse for having Bill come in and out of the living area to accommodate the various miscommunications that need to arise is him wanting to check and sell shares on Jim's terminal. Quite rude conduct for a dinner guest, but let's give him a free pass and say that he's an obsessive. We also have Nancy not being able to see quite properly because of her contact lenses, and her having to take convenient breaks away from the living room in the ensuite facility of the bedroom in order to adjust the contact lenses. So that's both of the 2 guests needing to roam free in a slightly unlikely scenario in order for the plot to happen. On top of which, Terry later mistakes Bill for Jim from just yards away due to having had problems with her glasses, which she's taken off and now she can barely see at all.
Jim, darling!
It's a minor quibble, but I think it comes under the category of the audience wanting to see your solution, not wanting to see all your working out. And it's harder to have your working out go unnoticed if it's quite clunky. It's starting to feel like I'm giving this a bit of a mauling, but like I say, I didn't dislike it, I didn't hate it, I thought it was pretty funny and good in places, but there were some flaws. But let's come back to my original question. In what era would you suppose this was set, just going by that premise? Time period, contemporary. Now, I'm aware that contemporary can cover any period from World War II onwards, so it's not technically wrong to say that this piece is contemporary. But it's not exactly giving you all the information you might want either. On the same website, I noticed that Carol Churchill's Top Girls has the description time period contemporary 1980s. There, I think it's accounting for the references and the themes within the play that have to do with how some women got left behind in Maggie Thatcher's go-getting 1980s Britain. So for someone who wasn't aware of that, it's useful to see it up front on the website. In the case of No Dinner for Sinners, I think it might be quite easy, in the absence of any further information, to pick up the script and be impressed with the characters and think it's going to be a good fit for your drama group, and only much later realise, oh, hang on, I'm not quite sure this fits in the period we originally thought we were setting it in. Or indeed to not realise that at all until it's in front of an audience, which could be unhelpful. But let's make some fun out of the situation. I've left 8 clues scattered through this review like a trail of breadcrumbs that support my assertion. Did you spot them? A. We open up to find Jim playing Space Invaders. Space Invaders. Space Invaders. Not lounging in bed or on the sofa playing Candy Crush on a tablet, but playing Space Invaders. B. His cleaner, Edna, representing the lower echelons of London's workforce, is a crafty cockney. She's a bit batty, but she's not short on ideas of how to make a bit of money. But she's native English. She's not recently arrived from overseas, from Asia or Eastern Europe, where she would have the kind of language barrier that would make it difficult to make money doing anything other than fairly menial work. I'm not saying there are no more working class white English first language speakers working as cleaners in London anymore, but I'm saying they're probably the minority now in the modern city. C. A free water pistol in a box of cereal. Does that smack of the 21st century? You can look this up yourselves online, but issuing free plastic toys in cereal boxes in the UK seems to have started drying up in the late 1980s after a massive recall by Kellogg's on some plastic toys that were feared could choke children. They certainly moved away at that point from having the toys directly in amongst the cereal. They then started putting them, I'm told, between the cereal bag and the inside of the box. Whereas in the case of Jim, he's digging it out directly from within the cereal, which is why it goes all over the floor. D. Both Edna and Terry routinely refer to Jim as Mr. Watt.
No, Mr. Watt!
Now, I've been working in office environments for the last 25 years. I've never come across anyone right up to the chief exec who gets called Mr. in front of his name, or her name if it's a lady. I don't have any experience in how people are addressed by their cleaners, but it doesn't feel like the kind of thing that would be commonly heard in the last 30 years. E. Jim hits up those old girlfriends in Act 1 using his little black book and the house phone. There's no text messaging, no WhatsApp, no social media, it's a book and a landline. F. Terry, Jim's personal assistant, let's assume the finance world still has personal assistants, she's come by so that Jim can sign some reports on the weekend that she needs to send away.
Brought some papers for Mr. Watt. I'm Terry Pringle from his office.
Just think about that. Actual ink on an actual sheet of paper. When was that last part of the world of commerce? G. Helen doesn't try to message Jim to tell him that she's forgiven him and that she's on her way back. She just rocks up, even though she knows he's likely to be in the middle of something. And Terry does exactly the same. Almost like digital messaging hadn't been invented. And H. Bill doesn't use a portable device to monitor shares. He has to keep nipping away to Jim's study to use the terminal. How many of those 8 did you find? Now, they're all minor details really, aren't they? But it's the central premise that fundamentally doesn't fit with the time period we're being told this exists in. I don't think it fits in any time period after, say, the mid-90s. In UK law, the Equality Act 2010 brought together a raft of previous laws that covered employment rights, discrimination and so forth, including listing marital status as a protected characteristic. So that's 2010, right? But many of its principles go back to earlier legislation like the Employment Rights Act 1996, which deals with unfair dismissal, and the Rights to Work Act 1995. Bill explains that in addition to being a member of the Anti-Permissive Society group, that group also has a financial interest in the company, making the case that these ultra-conservatives are calling the shots. Jim has a phone call with a contact from the French office, who reports that an unmarried executive he knew of wasn't sacked outright, but was transferred to an inhospitable backwater territory. This is trying to persuade us that the threat is real, and that constructive dismissal is not a thing. But we know the threat is not real because in a truly contemporary setting, that mindset is hopelessly old-fashioned and no longer has a foothold in the corporate world, and Jim would be protected by UK employment law. Also, if any group of people are economically mobile and can pick and choose who they work for, surely it's hotshot finance executives. Why doesn't Jim just tell Bill to get stuffed and go work for another company? Or wait until he can sue him for unfair dismissal and then go and work for another company? If Edward Taylor wrote No Dinner for Sinners in the run-up to its 2015 publication, he'd have been doing so in his 80s. And this gives credence to something I saw that said he'd actually written this in the 1990s. But even in the 1990s, I think it was already an idea with a pretty short shelf life. The glaring absence of modern technology proves that its true setting must have been pre-millennium, and that it never got revised prior to publication. At one point, when explaining to Terry that Edna does his cleaning, he uses the expression, "she does for me." Now that's such an old-fashioned phrase, it belongs in Agatha Christie works of the 1940s. I think if a production were to be explicitly set in the 1980s, you could have quite a lot of fun with the stage design and the music to give it that kind of 1980s flavour. And that would be a better show because the sense of menace would not then be so incongruous to the time period. And then the audience could sit back and really invest in the shenanigans and not be brought out of the tale by wondering, when is this set? And that was my unflinching review of the stage play No Dinner for Sinners by Edward Taylor. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.